Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to No More Missed Opportunities. This episode was inspired by a recent client situation that really grieved me because I thought, oh no, she's missing opportunities and she didn't even realize it. And I'm wondering if that might be helpful for those of you listening, because there might be things that we're doing we don't even realize. And in this case, this is a fairly high level person who wanted a promotion or wanted more opportunities, something different. She's been in the same job for quite a long time. And she had asked her boss, hey, I'm looking for more opportunities. I'm really curious what might be there. And this person is a really hard worker. She's incredibly diligent, really high value add. And what she learned was that the person that had an opportunity that she could have potentially applied for, the person themselves just said, I can't really speak much to her because she doesn't put on her camera during our meetings and she doesn't contribute most of the time. And this was really hard information for the person to hear, but very helpful. And like any of us, I'm sure you can relate that when you get that hard news, but it's also really helpful because you're recognizing that, wow, this is actually holding me back. And it's the thing that sometimes we need to hear to make a change. And that's why I want to offer you today 3 ways to be visible so that you can be seen, that you can avoid missing any of these opportunities. Before I jump into the 3, I'm reminded of a story from the book Radical Candor. Radical. My goodness, I feel like I can't speak today. Radical Candor. And it was such a great story of the woman, the author Kim, who was having the conversation with, at the time, her boss, Sheryl Sandberg. And they had gone into an important meeting. And this is the opening story in the book, by the way. They had gone into a meeting and Kim really felt like she nailed it. It was a very important meeting with the founders of Google, some high ups at Google, and left the meeting. And Cheryl just said to her, hey, I want to talk to you about something. And Cheryl said, you tend to say a lot. And Kim kind of blew it off like, yeah, whatever. And then I believe she nudged her a second. And then the third time she said, hey, let me tell you something. I need to, like, she literally pulled her aside and said, when you say so many times, it makes you look stupid. And that is what it took for Kim to go, oh my goodness, okay, I need to change this. Sometimes we need to hear those hard truths for us to make a change. And like some of you have heard me talk about before, we always have to have a compelling reason to do something. If we don't have a compelling enough reason, we're not going to change. And my ask of each of you would be, what is your compelling reason? Is it worth it for you to make some of these changes that we'll talk about today? So let's talk about the first one to avoid missing any more opportunities. Number 1 is to speak up. My client had a really good point, and I get it. It's frustrating. She said, first of all, she says, one of the reasons that I don't speak up most of the time is that there's a lot of talk going back and forth. I'm not necessarily contributing anything new. I don't feel like I putting myself in the mix of that. I'm taking a few creative liberties here because she didn't give a full-on assessment of this exactly. But the point that I want to make here is that she just felt like it didn't really matter. Like she wasn't adding value and she didn't want to speak if she wasn't adding value. So she said, so do you just make something up and just talk for the sake of talking? And I said, yes. Now, I don't love the idea of manufacturing something that isn't necessary necessarily, but sometimes you've got to at least show what you're thinking. Sometimes it's validating a point. Or as I always like to say, here's another tip for you, is to speak first. So my number 1 out of these 3 tips today is speak up. And related to that is speak first. That's all number 1. Speak up and speak first. Because what can happen is we maybe aren't that comfortable. Maybe it is probably on a virtual meeting nowadays, and you feel like, oh, I just don't want to have to interject. Is it really worth it? Starting first, you've got to be seen to be able to get promoted, to be able to move into different opportunities. So the best way to be seen is to actually use your voice. Our voice has a lot of power, but we often don't think about it. But all the thoughts that you're having in your head are not going to do anybody any good if they're not said out loud. So I'd highly recommend you come up with something and think about it in advance. If you're going to a meeting, you generally know what the meeting is about, I would hope. And if you can think, hey, what might I want to add here? Where could I add value? What could I say that would contribute in a way that's meaningful? And so at the very least, so I would say speak first, because you can get your idea out first, and then you don't have to constantly be just to say something saying, oh, I agree with so and so, or I want to validate that. But starting first, especially there's that moment. I love Mel Robbins, and she talks about, well, she wrote the book, The 5-Second Rule, that when you have that gut feeling of, oh, I should volunteer, or, in a meeting when somebody says, hey, who wants to start? Who wants to kick this off? Be that person. But if we wait longer than 5 seconds, we probably won't do it. Be that person. In fact, I missed a huge opportunity many, many years ago in my 20s when I was working or I was in a group, not working, I was performing and singing. It was an educational and leadership program called Up with People. And we were in the staging section, or we were doing staging, meaning we were in Tucson for 6 weeks learning the choreography and the songs. And we were all sitting on stage, about 100 of us sitting on stage. And the director said, Kelly goes, oh, we didn't pick a part for this person. He goes, we have this speaking part. Who wants to do a speaking part? We need somebody to do it. My first reaction was yes. And I wanted to raise my hand, but I didn't. And the woman next to me raised her hand, and she got that part for an entire year. I missed out, and I don't want that to happen to anybody else. So speak up and speak first. Definitely an important tip here. The second point, ways to be visible, is to have a point. And that might sound trite or just duh. Of course, Karen, I'm going to have a point. But a lot of times what happens is we start talking, and as I've told many of you before who follow me, I'm a recovering rambler. I get it. I've taught myself to stop rambling, or at least to avoid it. So have a point, be mindful in advance. What is the point that I want to make? What is the main idea that I want to get across? You don't want to spend a lot of time leading into what it is. And then, oh, there's my point. Now, if you do find yourself rambling, one of two things you can do. Actually, two things I would recommend. First thing is simply to pause, gather your thoughts. In the second of time that it would take you to gather your thoughts, it's not any time at all to the audience, but to you, it might feel like forever. But pause first, gather your thoughts, and then remember, oh yeah, I got to get to the point. Another thing that you can do that's a little more explicit is still to pause, but then say out loud, and my point is this. That not only puts you on track and back on track, it puts your audience on track, and they can go, oh, great, she's getting to the point. Or now we know what her point is. And if there's any doubt of what your point was, that will clear it up. But even better, the main tip here is to have a point. Think about it in advance. What do you want to contribute? How do you want to say it and make it short and succinct? Definitely want to get to that point quickly. And a way that you can say it is just, so sometimes people will say, well, Karen, how do I interject? How do I jump in? If somebody's saying, okay, does anybody else have something to add? You could say, I'd like to add this. Or you don't even have to be given that permission. You can just jump in and say, I'd like to add, or I'd like to interject, or here's a thought that I had. And keep in mind, if your meetings are virtual, when you're listening to this, you can lean forward a little bit, depending upon how many people are in your meeting room virtually, people can generally see you, even a few people. So remember that if you have, I think it's less than 12 or even less than 15, something like that, people can still see you. But even if not everybody can see you, some people can see you. So I say that to make the point of physically leaning forward and maybe even putting your hand up like you want to speak, because putting your palm forward into a little bit toward the camera can be a way to show that, hey, I want to interject, not in the camera, but just above your shoulder. Like, hey, I wanted to interject. That with a lean in and saying, I'd like to interject, is all the cues that you would need to be able to do that. Another option is to raise your hand with an emoji, or you could put in the chat, I'd like to go next, or I'd like to interject, or something like that, or I have something to add. That's another thing that you could say to be helpful to get your message heard. So definitely have that point, stick to it, and say it right up front so people don't wonder what that is. You don't want them to lose their attention span and get bored because you might be rambling or on a tangent. The third point is to share relevant examples. There's nothing like a good example or a good story to grab people's attention and make them want to keep listening. So adding something in that would be relevant. I want to give you an example that was really fun from one of my clients who's an engineer. I was helping him present to the board of directors for the company where he worked. And his job was the money guy. He said, I walk in, he goes, how could I possibly share an interesting example? And I thought, what are you talking about? You've got probably tons of examples. So we started brainstorming. I started asking him, hey, what do you like doing? What are you passionate about? And he said, well, I'm really passionate about sports. And then all of a sudden, as we kept talking, he goes, oh, I know what I could do. And what he did is, as right before he started presenting, he said, what is the first thing that you do when you go to a sporting event? You walk in, you get your soda or your beer and your popcorn, and you walk in. What's the first thing you look at? The scoreboard. That's what I'm here today to do for you, is to show you the scoreboard of where we're at with the company, where we've been, where we need to go. And it was brilliant. It was such a simple example. And it doesn't have to be really big and dramatic. So obviously he was leading that portion of the meeting. But let's say you're a contributor or an individual contributor in a meeting. Maybe you're not officially presenting at the meeting, but you want to add something, you want to contribute. It could be something like, hey, I got to share this quick example. And last week when we were in that meeting, blah, 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 blah. Or if we go with the scoreboard example, it could be something as simple as an analogy where you say, like a scoreboard, the first thing that you walk into is that. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about today, is where we're at with the numbers. Can we talk about budget? Something like that. Think about analogies. And here's the key with sharing an irrelevant example. A lot of people feel like, but I don't know what to share. Well, start looking for examples. Start noticing. If it helps you, write them down. Have a list of examples and things that you could share, because a lot of times we forget. It's the same thing for me with the client examples that I have. If I don't state them when they're fresh, I sometimes forget too. I'll have to write them down and share something, or write them down so that I can remember to share them later. So those 3 tips will help you to avoid missing future opportunities. Let's review. First one, speak up and speak first. That's related to the same thing. Speak up and speak first. Number 2, have a point. Get to it, stick to it, and be done. I love the phrase, be brief, be bright, be done. Number 3, share relevant examples. Look for them. Be an example spotter around the world. Honestly, I do this all the time. I'm always trying to figure out, how can I weave that into my next client situation? Or how can I weave that into my next presentation? If we can do that, that makes them even more relevant. An example period is helpful. but a really relevant example that's recent, that's current, that is related to the audience, that really stands out. Because my wish for each of you is to get the opportunities that you want and for you to stand out as an influential communicator, an influential leader. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up this episode. This was a quickie today, but hopefully you walked away with some tips that you can use. And I would say get out there and practice one of these in the next week so you too can stand out with unshakable confidence. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.